podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, one of the world's leading international professional bodies, which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide.
I'm one of your hosts, Christian van Nieuwerburgh, Professor of Coaching and Positive Psychology at the Center for Positive Health Sciences at RCSI, and I'm very interested in the integration of coaching and positive psychology.
And I'm Paula Nacif, Wellbeing Coach and Researcher and Senior Lecturer at the Masters of Positive Psychology and Coaching Psychology at the University of East London.
We are delighted to bring you this 7-part series exploring the similarities and differences between coaching for well-being and health coaching.
These terms are often used interchangeably, but this series suggests they represent very distinct practices.
We have lined up some incredible guests who share their insights, ideas, and experiences in health and well-being contexts.
We aim to provide answers and understanding on this fascinating and important area of coaching and many more questions. Today we're joined by Dr. Andrew Parsons, a former leading biomedical researcher and development scientist who found his way into developing a coaching service for cancer patients in the NHS. He's a master accredited coach and mentor with the European Mentoring Coaching Council, and he's one of the founder members of the Fountain Centre at the Royal Surrey NHS Foundation Trust, which supports those impacted by cancer. Andrew is a published author and brings a wealth of experience in wellness and well-being coaching. Welcome, Andrew. It's really nice to be here with you today and with Christian to talk about coaching and mental health. I'll introduce you really briefly and then I'll probably invite you to share what else you would like to share with our listeners. I know you for a few years and I've appreciated your work, your writing, and also your work as a practitioner in the world. So Andrew is a leading biomedical research and development scientist who found his way into developing coaching in service of cancer patients in the National Health Service in the UK. So it's a real pleasure to have you here today, Andrew. What else would you like to share with our listeners about yourself?
Oh, I don't know, really. I'm still surprised when I hear that. 'Cause when I started my career a good few years ago now, this would have been one of the things I would have almost certainly guaranteed I'd never find myself doing. But that's kind of an interesting space. I guess other relevant things that I've been involved with. So I'm a Master Certified Coach for the EMCC. I'm a registered hypnotherapist of all things, which is one of the paths I came into coaching through. And also have some health promotion certifications, which might be interesting for our conversation today. So just a little bit of a background there. And yeah, that's me. So I originally trained in pharmacology and then various masters and a PhD, was involved in leading neuroscience efforts for creating new medicines for migraine and stroke. And interestingly, one of my jobs in the industry was working across organizations and across cultures. And I had a leadership position, and that's how I got into coaching, actually, is that power of communication. And from a wellbeing perspective, in an innovation centre, the wellbeing of our teams was actually really crucial for people to have the best ideas and be creative and take appropriate risks. So that's how I sort of came into wellbeing, really, as well, was through my role as a leader in R&D.
Wow, that's a very rich professional experience that you have. In our first episode, we discussed a little bit about the umbrella of coaching for well-being being very multifaceted and involving all aspects of people's lives, talking about coaching for well-being as a flourishing, helping people flourish and make decisions that are supportive of their well-being. We also discussed the importance of thinking about coaching for health as a specific area of work that helps people manage long-term physical and mental health conditions. And specifically, Christian's interest is in positive health coaching. So it's that kind of crossover between coaching for well-being and lifestyle medicine, looking at experts in the health sector to support people as they navigate their way through their health and experiences. And today we touched upon mental health. I mean, mental health and mental ill health is something that we hear all the time, perhaps even more so after the pandemic. There seems to be a lot of more open dialogues and discussions around mental health. So So the idea for today is that you tell us a bit about your experience of that work, because you've got such a rich professional background, and help us think through. We don't know the answers to all the questions, but there are many questions in this area, and we're thinking about supporting practitioners and others in this area to ask more questions and think about the professional and ethical practice.
Brilliant.
So perhaps a good way to start is, how do you define mental health? I mean, what is mental health, or what are your thoughts around the phrase even?
Oh, as ever, and I'm trying not to sound like a coach. I think it depends, because it depends who you ask, really. There may be a whole range of different perspectives on that. And just interestingly, actually, I'm also a certified health coach as well. And I think it's kind of interesting when we think about the health focus and the well-being focus, because actually there may be a continuum there that we can actually think about health and well-being from. And even what's the definition of health? Let's go to health before we go to mental health. I'm still not sure if there's a unifying definition of health that we can all sign up to and all agree. I always go back to the World Health Organization's definition, which is it's so much more than the absence of disease. It's our physical, our social, and our mental well-being. And then, of course, well, what's well-being? Well, that's another interesting area to discuss. And, being a biologist by training, there's a certain amount of opinions that our facts may be based upon in terms of our professional orientation there as well. Mental health isn't absolute. It's like many of these things, it's a continuum. It's not static either. It can change depending on what's going on in our lives and our experiences, and our past experiences. But again, I'll just come back to the WHO, because it's sort of things around active well-being. I think it was at the Foresight Commission 2008 came up with the 5 behaviours for wellbeing, which I think are a really interesting place to think about when we come into that active wellbeing space, around noticing mindfully, being active, giving, learning, and connecting. Relationships are very important for us in terms of our connections that we have. It's also about achievement and realising our potential, and having the ability to sort of manage what's going on in our life. I think from a clinical perspective, people often talk about that in coping mechanisms. And I'm not sure that really lands with me, and we'll come on to language a little bit more, because actually, just in my life, there's so many things go on a day-to-day basis. I'm not sure I'm coping with them, I'm navigating them. I'm trying to get to where I need to be. And I think a really interesting space is that, contribution and productivity, because my understanding is the WHO definition has a work orientation associated with it as well, which is interesting because, I can be, what's my well-being if we're rapidly approaching retirement now, but, what happens to our well-being when we're no longer working in that way? So there's lots of things maybe to think about there. And of course, it depends what our orientation is and where we're working. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Andrew. Yes. It does, and I agree with you. There is so much more than the absence of disease, and the 5 ways to well-being that you mentioned, it is something that just gives us an indication of all those different aspects. For us as coaches, when you think about navigating that field, if you like. I've heard you in the past talking about the scope of our practice, and I really like that phrase. I have adopted, by the way, and I keep now saying the scope of practice because it seems to help us make sense of some of those boundaries when we think about people's health and mental health. Could you explain a little bit to us what scope of practice is and your thoughts around that in relation to those working in this very complex area of coaching?
I think it's a really interesting way of bringing what we do to our work. I became a coach through being a complementary therapist, which was a really interesting experience for me. And it was really interesting, actually, because I had a role where I was working across the different cultural groups and different organisational groups. And the age-old problem of being a leader across these type of interfaces is, how do we get effective communication between us all? My wife was a former psychiatrist, but works as a counsellor, and we just talked about this one day, and she said, go and have a look at this NLP stuff, you'll really love that. And of course, being somebody who jumps in with both feet usually, I sort of went and learned, but also then became very interested in NLP and the construct of hypnotherapy. And of course, to practice as a hypnotherapist, there's actually a really very well laid out scope of practice that we need to adhere to, depending on where you train. But, if you're registered with the CNHC, there's some very detailed scope of practice and some ways of operating and working that we have as, if I can use the term, health professionals or complementary health professionals.
CN, what is that?
Oh, I should get the acronyms right. CNHC, so it's the Complementary Natural Healthcare Council, something along those lines. Yeah, dyslexia gets in the way of me remembering names, so that might be correct, it might not be. But the essence for that was actually it's really important for us to know where our boundaries are. And particularly when we're working in a clinical environment, even more so. That was part of my experience of bringing the coaching service into a wonderful charity called the Fountain Centre down at the Royal Surrey in Guildford. By happenstance, a very good friend of mine was introduced to them, and somehow we ended up thinking about, well, actually, coaching could really fit in the support they provide to patients. How can we bring this to life, and how can we build that into a voluntary coaching service for people? And that very much at the get-go, we were very, very keen to establish, well, what's the scope of coaching in terms of the relationship to the other wonderful services that the charity was bringing in support of people. And just that orientation helped us really think about, well, what is that scope of practice in which we operate? Especially because you've got counselling, hypnotherapy, acupuncture, massage, other complementary practices. How do we really define what coaching brings, and how do we ensure that everybody knows what we're doing, for one thing, and build that trust in the community? But perhaps even more importantly, so that the clients using the service know where they are.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And thank you for the amazing work you're doing to really set this area of work. Now, our listeners on this podcast, I think there'll be coaches here, there'll be positive psychology practitioners, there'll be health professionals as well. So thinking specifically of coaches and positive psychology practitioners, from that perspective, who would you say can work in this area of coaching for mental health?
Oh, well, I think it comes back to what's the orientation in which you're working, and where are you working, and what do we mean by mental health? I would suggest there's a couple of different ways in which we can bring that. So the short answer is everyone. Then it depends. It gets very specific in terms of whether we've got some specialisms and some ability to work with people in those areas. I think one of the most important things maybe to think about is being trauma-informed in our work. I've just recently seen some data where I think there's like 70-80% of people experience something potentially traumatic in their life, or will, but not everybody goes on to experience post-traumatic stress disorder or other traumatic events. But that awareness of being able to work with people who may have different experiences, I think, is really key.
Yeah, so definitely anybody wanting to work in this area would have to have that. Arguably, all coaches need it from what you're saying, but especially if you're going to work in this area. Thanks for clarifying that, Andrew.
So I think our ability to sort of emotionally regulate and be present with ourselves and our clients is absolutely key.
Andrew, when you mentioned the work that you do at the centre and all these different professionals together, which is amazing, actually, and the support is so much needed. For coaches, and I'm also curious, because every day I get asked the question, what are the boundaries between coaching and counselling? And I'm not sure that we've got time to actually bottom this up and put a stick on the ground and say that's the line. But I think it's worth thinking about that in this space, because mental health, as you said, it depends on the definition. It depends on the client, what they're experiencing, what they're coming to coaching for, and what the outcome might be expected. What are your views about those boundaries, especially when you think about the scope of practice? Do we then think about training, the right training, or what are the pointers that you can give us and our listeners about that?
Oh, a couple of different perspectives to throw them out there, because I think there's the governance perspective, which is absolutely key. There's the individual perspective, and then the relationship between coach and supervisor and coach and client, which I think, for me, it just really highlights the importance of coach supervision. And it's so much more than mentoring or practice. It's that can be really important to have that restorative space for people, particularly if you're working with people who are not going through particularly a great time. But, our ability to work in that space then becomes key with the training and the understanding and the recognition of where our capabilities end. I think one really surefire way to bring that into the fore is through supervision. One of the things that we were really keen on when we built the service was that there would be supervision for all coaches, and there was an expectation that coaches would have supervision and then take part in the supervision through the service. And that's so important in terms of building skills and capabilities as a coach, but also that space to help us understand what might become more of a normal way, or the way in which we operate in that centre, in that space. So I think there are certain things that we need to be aware of in terms of our own presence and our own working. And I think that's a great conversation to have with your individual supervisor. I think from a governance perspective, it becomes really interesting as well, because particularly when you're working in a healthcare setting, safety and confidentiality of our clients or patients, as it would be, in the centre, that's front and centre of everything that, drives all activities that we do. So knowing our capabilities and having the appropriate training to be working in this area is really, really important.
I love the vision and how you've made that centre come to life. I'm thinking from the patient perspective, to what extent do patients select the kind of support that they need? Or what is the ideal way of setting that up, Andrew?
There's usually a conversation with a practitioner, somebody who can help people, help direct them or help them understand what service best works for them. And of course, that depending on who's in the service and how that service develops, because I think what makes this even more complicated is, of course, coaching is used in therapy, but not all coaches are therapists. And therefore, there's a fundamental tension in this space. And just to set out a stall, I'd say actually there's no grey area between coaching and counselling, because I work as a coach, not a counsellor.
For our listeners, I love the idea of no gray area, because I think our listeners, and especially coaches, are concerned about that. So how would you elaborate on that idea that there is no gray area?
I think Anna had a hand up, but just a quick couple of thoughts. For me, one of the orientations we've been thinking about for coaches working in this space, some of the ideas we put down on this, and I can send you the papers for folks to read, actually. There's a paper that I wrote with a good colleague of mine, Sue Jackson, in 2016, when we're trying to have this conversation about, hey, we've been working with people with neurodegenerative diseases, in pain management services, in cancer services. We're coaches in this space. We're not therapists, we're not clinicians, we're not psychotherapists, but actually, we're helping people develop their perspectives, their thoughts, have a space to reflect on their emotions, and develop new skills and capabilities to navigate or cope, as we may say, from a more clinical perspective, with their situation. And I think that's very much a coaching orientation. And for me, it's more of a health promotion rather than an intervention.
Right. That's very helpful.
And if you go all the way back to the 1970s, there's a tremendous amount of research done around a concept called salutogenesis, which people use, but actually the fundamental of all that for me is rather interesting, because it's that, how do we balance the challenges we face with the resources we have or can acquire, and that inherent sense of coherence that we can have, which for some people, it depends on our genes and our early years and so forth and so on. But I would suggest also the skills and capabilities we can develop help us manage and negotiate those tensions and stresses. So from a mental well-being perspective, I think that health promotion area is absolutely one space in which we can actually really focus as coaches. It's not interventionist. It's not talking about mental ill health. It's how do we support our clients to build their own skills and capabilities. It's developmental coaching.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I think there is something else now that I need to borrow from you. It is not an intervention, it's a health promotion thing, because I don't like the word intervention. Every time I say it, I usually say, I don't like this word, but here I am, I'm using it again, or using it, saying as a tool. I love this aspect. This is a health promotion activity and partnership and support for people across different contexts. I think the work that you do that is really powerful for us to think about is that, you are working with potentially perceived vulnerable populations and demographics. And that's where sometimes people get a little bit like, oh, I'm not sure. And one of the things that I wanted to pose to you is the fact that my experience and my view is that even someone who may have been diagnosed with a mental illness and is being medicated for it, or perhaps has a medical plan of support, doesn't necessarily that they are then going to have really poor well-being. Because if their condition is really well managed, then they can have really high levels of well-being. The opposite is also true. And we see a lot of people languishing, people who are not really well in their well-being, and they don't have any mental illness that has been diagnosed. So the spectrum that you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. And as coaches, how do we navigate some of that as well? Because there is a lot of, when you look at the figures around mental health or mental ill health, is around all of us. So working with people who might not be at the best in terms of the mental health is a sure fact. If you work with a lot of people over a period of time, that you will encounter someone who are having a tough time.
We will be. It's people. It's what we experience, isn't it? I think having that conversation with your supervisor is a great way to start, because it does depend on our training, our understanding, our capabilities, our own functioning, which can be impacted by what's going on in our lives as well. So I think having that additional level there, I think, is really key. And I guess from a positive psychology perspective, is it Corey Keynes who did that whole health continuum model? We've got health and ill health and then languishing and flourishing. I think that's a wonderful way to approach your thoughts around where's my space, where's my boundaries. And of course, flourishing for me isn't particularly the language I would use with clients, because if you're dealing with something you didn't particularly want to have and it's not very nice, flourishing isn't the language that usually lands with people, but empowered is. And I think for me, that's a space where we can start that conversation with ourselves, with our supervisors and such. And just that whole area then around, well, actually, we may not know if somebody's got a mental health illness, and we may not ask, they may not disclose. So how do we gain that ability to know, am I working safely here? Some years ago, I tuned into at the time, it wasn't the Division of Coaching Psychology, it was the Special Group in Coaching Psychology, with a presentation by Professor Sarah Corrie, working with a health awareness tool. And I just thought absolutely nailed the boundaries of the orientations that we were working with at the time in our coaching service for cancer patients. It's not a diagnostic tool, but it's a wonderful reflective tool, which we can use for ourselves and as supervisors, actually, in supporting people develop good practice. And it's just a very simple 4-box model as ever, looking at resources and function.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. And we can definitely gather that and add to the podcast for our listeners.
Yeah.
So that there is something in there. Sorry, Christian is also waiting to ask you a question, so I'll let him.
Thank you, Andrew. I think Anna and I are both so excited to have such wisdom and experience to share. So thank you so much, Andrew. Again, I'm now thinking about from the health professional's perspective. So if we take the health professional's perspective, when is the situation when they are most likely to think the best person to refer my patient or client to, rather than a hypnotherapist or a therapist, is a coach?
Great question. I think as a profession, there's a certain amount of education we need to do there within healthcare professionals, and not just from a health coaching perspective either,
right,
but from that learning and developmental side of coaching that I think is more the advanced level of coaching that can bring in. I think it's through experience. When we started the service, I ended up doing a lot of conversations with the support services and the allied health professionals just to help them understand, well, what is this coaching thing? And actually, where does it fit? And then what really made the difference, I think, for the service was spending time working with people so that they understood how we worked. Importantly, where our boundaries were, how we signpost when we didn't think coaching was the right thing for me to be doing as a practitioner or in the best interests of our client. So all that becomes really key. And I do believe one of the big challenges we have at the moment is actually the governance and the accreditation of professional coaches, because actually there are these grey areas, shall we say, where there may be overlap of practice for good reasons. And that's something that we really can spend maybe more time developing better governance processes and guidance. There's no right answer or wrong answer for why would a health professional direct somebody to a coach, apart from perhaps their own experience and what their own clients and their own patients are telling them. And I think that's the value add, isn't it? That becomes really key.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And this series of podcasts is, like Anna said, what we're hoping for is that it'll raise further questions and encourage, given the huge interest in this area, that we can start to answer some of these questions collaboratively. So that's so useful, Andrew. Thank you so much. Anna?
Yes, there are a couple of things. The first one is just for the listeners. When you talked about the coaching psychology division, you mentioned the British Psychological Society,
yeah.
I guess. Is that what you... Yeah. So for those of you wondering, which is now a division, a coaching psychology division within the British Psychological Society and regulates people in psychology. Just to clarify that for people. And the second one is, can you give us a little bit of a snapshot of what it's like to work with people who are experiencing cancer as a coach?
Oh, it's wonderful. I don't think there's any other word to say it, actually. And interestingly, it's something I didn't particularly want to get involved with. I lost both parents to cancer, and it was something I really didn't want to go anywhere near. But as ever, the universe tends to throw us some learning opportunities, doesn't it? We can lean in or not. But my friend introduced me to the centre there and said, well, just come down and talk to the folks. And as I went down there, I just had a nudge that this was something that I should lean into. And so it was very uncomfortable to start with, because it raises all sorts of questions about our own mortality and particularly meeting our own family members or loved ones that have had a cancer experience, or even our own cancer experience. That is something maybe to consider, negotiate and reflect upon. But working with people who are going through a difficult time and helping them as best we can by being there or enabling them. It's interesting, the word help, isn't it? Because I know some coaches don't like to use the word help. But, if we go to that Bridge of Spies movie, it's how can we be useful? And a useful conversation is worth its weight in gold, which seems to be increasing very dramatically at the moment. And I would just say, supporting a useful conversation for people when they're in that difficult space, it's wonderful. Can be challenging. And just to give you a flavour, in the service we work with all stages of the experience. But actually, a lot of people have counselling, a lot of people go to other support mechanisms. But, through diagnosis, through treatment, post-treatment, and even towards end of life, there's a role for a coach.
Yeah. Thank you for that work. I think what comes to my mind is that sometimes when we think about coaching, we're thinking about movement outcomes. In positive psychology coaching, we're thinking about meaning connection. I'm thinking about meaning connection, rather. I know it's linked to positive psychology. I really love the existential philosophy and approach, which is life happens and you've got all these big questions about identity, mortality, and all of that. And I think you can't escape those experiences when people are experiencing a long-term health condition or sometimes at end of life, a terminal condition. And I think it's such a privilege to be able to sit with those people and listen to them and be with, rather than trying to achieve anything, is actually just be with someone in that moment. And I think it's beautiful work, Andrew.
I think witnessing is a word that I often use when we're helping people understand. We can witness, and that in its own way can be incredibly useful for people. There's something there about the outcome which I think is really interesting. Because, oddly enough, I would have classed myself as an executive coach, and I was one of the business leaders who was involved in setting up the internal coaching platform at GSK many, many years ago. That really helped when we were setting up the coaching service for cancer patients. But one of the things I'm very acutely aware of is as a leader, if I was using a coaching approach, and as a professional coach, is that different attribution of outcome. As a leader using a coaching approach, well, we have a joint investment in that outcome. As a professional coach working with somebody, the outcome is nothing to do with me. And I think that's the space we can really support people in, is being with them to find what they're looking to achieve through the coaching process.
Yeah, I call it a detached compassion. A compassionate detachment, something you still want to be with someone, you still want to help them, if you want to use that word, but you are detached from the outcome because that is for them to decide, and how far they go, how fast or how slow, and how they go about it. But we kind of detach from that, because I think that's how we can best serve people without imposing potentially our own selves onto them and onto their experience. And I think in this area of well-being, health, mental health, where life is very present with all its facets, I think it becomes even more important that we are able to look at ourselves and think about ourselves in that process as well. So I think there is a lot of work that we need to do personally to be able to serve others.
And that's our own capabilities, isn't it, really? That's something we do ourselves. It reminded me, actually, I had a client tell me once, actually, the biggest thing that they got from was actually just talking to somebody who didn't judge them.
Yeah. And Andrew, as I was listening to you, I was thinking detached and connected at the same time. And you said, we were joking that gold is going up in value. But what do you think of the idea that human connection is also going up in value right now?
Well, I'd like to think so. Because I think that's where the money is. We're social beasts, aren't we?
Yeah. And in a time of AI as well, Andrew, because I'm all for reflecting on how can AI allow us to reach more people, support more people, and all of this. But within that, holding firm, you've talked about orientation towards salutogenesis, an orientation towards positive health. But there's just a very human part to coaching that maybe it's valuable to protect. What do you think?
Absolutely. And it will change and it will develop and emerge. It was really interesting. Last year, I spent some time at the New York Coaching Technology Conference. And it was fascinating to see a range of digital coaches coming through, and they were fantastic. They're absolutely fantastic. And where they were really adding most value at that moment for me was hey, these are basic skills that are really good to develop, and a digital coach can really bring in and support that. And then you've got the scale. I noticed through some of the business coaching that I do now, actually, when I was an aspiring leader in organizations, there was so much support for you in terms of building soft skills and developing leadership tools and competencies. That's not there so much nowadays. And I think that level of skill support is absolutely wonderful. And I can see that's where the biggest impact will be in the short term. It will also get to that space of creativity. But I think this is one of the areas where there's a difference between therapy and coaching. Because in coaching, we don't have a therapeutic relationship. I'm not a health professional working with you to resolve these issues. As a coach, we can work collaboratively. And when we're working collaboratively, it's that spark of creativity that can come through, maybe it's not something that we can articulate or know, but something we can co-create in the moment. That's that space of human connection, which is just wonderful to see that spark happen. If we go all the way back in terms of, our definition of well-being, as a wellness professional, it's holistic.
Yeah.
We can't just separate one area of these out. It's all of them. It's the system.
Yeah. Thank you. That's such a beautiful way of describing it, Andrew. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
And it makes me think about some of the questions that we may have in terms of scope of practice, what we do, what we don't do, our capabilities, our professional stance and ethics, because it makes me think about the human experience and that relational space. Even when I think about well-being and mental health or mental illness, is that who is the person in front of me and how they're experiencing whatever it is that they're saying they're experiencing, regardless of what labels they might give to them or others might give to their experience as well. And the ability to kind of step into that space and really explore people's experiences in that collaborative way that you've mentioned, that creative way where there's less of presupposition about what this is and more of curiosity and being with the other. That to me is, Christian, I'm answering your question actually, I think sideways in a way. The human is still very, very valuable in that, especially when you think about mental health and our place in the world and so on. I'd like to think that the human is still, or humans are still very, very important. And there are other ways to use technology and AI to support people.
Oh, yeah, it's going to happen. And it's great. The human bit, isn't it, that is so precious.
Thank you. I love talking about the human bit. That really animates me as well. Just because we're talking about end of life, we're talking about meaning and purpose. I'm curious, where do you see spirituality fitting into the kind of conversations we've been having?
Great question. Thank you. I just come back as a biologist or a scientist. It depends what you mean by spirituality, really, doesn't it? And whether that's a word that people use.
Yeah.
And I think it's that meaning for me. I remember having a conversation with a senior leader who had a safety critical role in an organisation. And I just mentioned, where's your energy around, spiritual issues? And so I'm not a spiritual person. And I just, we've just spent the last 6 months talking about how important it is for you to create a safe system for people to access your services. That seems like kind of a high sense of meaning to me.
Yeah.
I think meaning, and when we get clear what it is, it's a turbocharge for our lives.
Yeah. Thank you.
And for some, that may be spirituality.
There are many ways of looking at that, isn't there? It's the word and how people interpret what that is in relation to themselves, others. Spirituality is a very interesting word and it brings up all manner of connotations for people. When we think about that in terms, I'm thinking about different cultures, different communities, different ways of being in the world. And I mean that in the widest sense. And how important I think that is for what people wish for themselves in terms of the support they need in particular times of their lives, whether it's with support with their physical health or their mental health and what that can bring to people. And I think as coaches, again, it's that curiosity. How do we step into someone else's world and work with that?
Particularly towards the end of life, that challenges some of our own perceptions around that. And in many ways, they don't matter because it's the client's view of the world that is so important for us there. And maybe that's one of the most important things, actually, of working within a well-being orientation is that ability to work with meaning and spirituality, if that's the right word, that connection. And it's interesting, it's not just the connection within self, it's the connection of self to others. There's a collective consciousness there, if I can use that term. There's something, perhaps that essence that's around us that we can tap into. And I'm always amazed by what our ancestors could do that I don't think we could do today.
What do you mean? Give us an example.
Stonehenge.
Yeah. How did they do that?
How did they do that?
Yeah.
And how did they align it? There's something that we've lost with that connection with nature.
Wow. Beautiful.
I won't remember now, but there is a piece of research, anthropological research going on in the southern hemisphere, where there is a tribe of people who can navigate the seas through the movement of waves. There is a handful of them. They don't need anything, any instrument, nothing. It's just the movement of the waves. And this anthropologist is following these people around because they are literally dying down. And I was listening to this, it gives me goosebumps. I was just thinking about it, the connection with the natural world, that you can navigate the seas. The high seas is not like just going over, 100 meters. Through the movement of water is just an amazing thing to do. It's a kind of that sense of connection that people perhaps had, our ancestors, that perhaps we don't anymore. It's fascinating.
It's fascinating. From a physiology background, there's a lot there that we've lost the ability to sense, I think, and that feel of that connection and such, through very subtle changes in what we notice and around us.
I could speak with you forever, especially because you always bring this scientific, it's like, oh yeah, from a physics, and I hadn't even thought about that. Of course, there are lots of bodily sensations and physiology involved in the movement and everything else. In terms of bringing ourselves to a close, and you think about perhaps people listening to this and thinking about working with coaching for health and well-being, perhaps considering about the role of coaching in mental health, and there's an area of interest to them, what might be some pointers or some thoughts that you can leave us with if people are interested in this area?
Oh, great question. Travel widely and talk to many people, I think, is always a good one, isn't it? I think, because actually travel widely gives you different perspectives. And I feel very blessed that I've had the opportunity to live and work in different countries, even in different languages, over my very widespread career. And that actually is a wonderful learning experience, to see things as others may be able to see them, and not from myself. I think our own training and development is absolutely key. Train in areas that you may not be expected to train in. I think that gives you a whole different perspective. I once listened to somebody talk about how do we foster innovation in the biomedical space. And I thought it was lovely, actually. Maybe this is something just to think about, because actually they were talking about I people and T people. So an I person had an enormous depth of knowledge in one area. T people, they said, had a wide space around them in which they could draw different experiences together, but they still had an amount of depth in particular area. And they were saying, well, actually, that's the space of innovation, because you bring different ideas and different perspectives to the work I do. And I always wanted to be a pie person, which has more areas of depth, but a wider area of influence, because it's how we learn from other people's experiences and apply them to the area in which we're working, I think, is absolutely key. And I think to hold the intention, that's been perhaps one of the markers through my career, is I've always followed my passion. And I think if we follow that intention and passion to learn and develop our own best practice and good practice in a way that is really in service of the clients, that will be a good place to start, I think.
Thank you, Andrew. I really appreciated you here and our conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. On behalf of all of our listeners as well, it's just been a joy to listen to you. Thank you for inspiring all of us with the work that you do.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching.
For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organizations, and society.
To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com.
Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events for your continuing professional development.